NOAA, NOAA.
Okay, good. There's no comment. And do you have the list then? I'll just introduce our first witness then if you've got that. Okay, good. This hearing will come to order. Today we will begin our second full day of hearings on the American Clean Energy and Security Act. Yesterday we heard from 3 members of the Obama cabinet, from CEOs of the United States Climate Action Partnership, from Mayor John Fetterman of Braddock, Pennsylvania, and from numerous experts, scientists, and economists, all with a stake in the best way to go about creating a new energy economy. Today we will hear from 3 panels. The first panel will provide us with input on how best to allocate emission allowances in ways that can assist and benefit consumers. That panel includes representatives of major trade associations associated with electricity production and natural gas usage, as well as advocates for low-income consumers. The second panel will advise us on ways in which we can ensure international competitiveness and help encourage international participation in our efforts to fight global warming and maintain a level playing field. It will feature major stakeholders like Dow Chemical and the United Steel Workers. And our final panel will help us to understand how we can produce low-carbon electricity, both from coal with carbon capture and storage and from renewable energy sources like wind, geothermal, and solar. Today is about the nuts and bolts of our legislation, how we help consumers keep jobs here in America and begin transforming our energy system. With the information that we glean from today's witnesses, we can better craft solid solutions for our energy and environment future. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and I turn to recognize our ranking member if he has any introductory comments.
I hope you liked the movie last night. Chairman Markey and I were the co-hosts of the Disney movie on Earth last night, and that's one of the reasons why we finished panel 4 by 6:45, so we could get there to the opening. But I have no opening statement. Let's get right to it.
Let me turn to the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Waxman.
No opening statement.
Ask if he has any. And I do not see Mr. Barton. So let me then turn and introduce Jeff Sturber. He was elected chairman of the Edison Electric Institute in 2007. Edison Electric Institute is a national association of shareholder-owned electric companies, their international affiliates, and industry associates. He is also the chairman, president, and CEO of PNM Resources and Energy Holding Company, serving New Mexico and Texas. Mr. Sturber, please begin when you are ready.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the introduction, and I would first like to commend you and this committee for holding these hearings. This is a complex topic, and education and understanding of the ramifications of what you may do is an exceptionally important aspect of it, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to appear before the committee. I am here to represent Edison Electric Institute, and as an organization, we have endorsed principles associated with climate change that will help ensure that we can achieve the kinds of greenhouse gas reductions that are necessary, but to do it in a way in which we protect the impact on consumers. That is a very important aspect of, I think, this program, because electricity is so pervasive in everything that consumers use, whether you're a business, a residential consumer, or a major industry. For our industry, moving to a low-carbon future is about turning over capital stock. These are expensive, long-lived generation assets that are currently being paid for in customers' rates. The turnover of this capital stock is not going to be simple. It's not going to be cheap. It won't occur overnight. It has to be done in concert with the development of technologies that will allow us to move to low-carbon equipment to be used to meet customers' needs. Things like carbon capture and storage, which you have addressed in your proposed legislation. Care in this transition is paramount to ensure that the resulting cost increases to customers are reasonable and absorbable by the economy. We strongly believe that an allocation of allowances for the benefit of consumers is a critical part of this care in transition that will enable an affordable path to aggressive greenhouse gas reductions. I want to spend my limited time talking about why we believe the allocation of emission allowances to the electric sector is the most effective way to minimize adverse impacts on customers, and then to explain a specific proposal that EEI has developed that our entire membership has endorsed as to how this allocation could occur. The cap-and-trade system that Congress established to reduce sulfur dioxide as part of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 is truly the most successful example of a cap-and-trade system in the world. To date, emissions have been reduced by more than 50% at a cost far less than what was anticipated at the time it was done, and without the existence or the occurrence of any windfall profits. In that case, 97% of all allowances were allocated to regulated emission sources, and only 3% were put up for auction. In the proposed cap-and-trade system, by having allowances allocated to consumers, or allocated for the benefit of consumers, you avoid the double whammy. By double whammy, I mean customers having to pay for the higher costs of new resources that will have to be added, plus the cost of allowances to cover what you have to remit to cover the emissions that you have from existing fossil fuel resources. It's important to note that by allocating these allowances for consumer benefit, the primary goals of a cap-and-trade system are still intact. There's a price that's placed on carbon, which we need to understand and see so we can make informed decisions on resources, and the environmental improvements of greenhouse gas reductions occur just as they would if the allowances were auctioned. Now, some have argued that money raised by allowance auctions could be provided back to consumers as a means to buffer the cost impact. So what's the difference between that and allocating allowances to the distribution company to flow those benefits back to consumers? First, most of the proposals to implement either a low-income tax credit or send payments to individuals would not benefit commercial customers, industrial customers, the source of jobs within our economy. But it's not just that, it's also the impact on the balance of the public sector. What happens to hospitals? What happens to schools? They wouldn't receive the value. It would be going to consumers. And so the hospitals and bus stations and everything else that provides services to consumers, their rates would go up. And those costs would then be flowed on to consumers. So the increased cost of electricity would affect the economy through higher prices for goods and services, higher taxes for local governments to cover their cost. An allocation system that benefits all electricity consumers helps cushion these cost increases through the economy. And I think also the efficiency of not taking the money from consumers through high electricity prices in the first place seems, at least to me, to be a better solution than taking it and then trying to pass it back to consumers through taxation and/or spending policies. Another argument that's made against allocations is that, look at the European situation, and it led to windfalls. So we shouldn't have that happen, so let's not make allocations. But what led to windfalls was because of the structure of their system in the EU. First, they over-allocated allowances because they did not have a good baseline on what greenhouse gas emissions were. In the United States, we have that good baseline. Second, they made the allocations totally to all unregulated generators in the electricity sector. And it's a competitive market that they operate in over there, where many of the states in the United States are not competitive markets at the retail side. And the result was that they got some benefit of price uplift, and they also got an allocation. That led to windfalls. The approach that we are proposing and that EEI has developed ensures that that will not occur, because we know what the baseline of greenhouse gas emissions are, and we know how to structure a system through the allocations being given to the regulated side of the business to the largest extent, so that they flow through to the benefit of customers. Let me briefly walk through the EEI proposal so that that's out on the table. The initial allocation to the electric power sector should be 40% of all allowances, because that's the proportion of our sector share of the national greenhouse gas carbon dioxide emissions. This 40% allocation should remain in place until critical technologies such as carbon capture and storage, which are essential to achieving long-term climate policy objectives, are commercially available. Then our sector's share could gradually decline as consumer costs for cleaner energy would also decline. Within the electric sector, these allowances would be divided among regulated distribution companies and merchant coal generators, only merchant coal generators. Merchant coal generators would receive allowances based on about 50% of their base year emissions. And this is solely to cover that portion of the cost that isn't recovered through the marketplace. There is a clear agreement on our part that there should not be windfalls to merchant coal generators, and what we're proposing is very different than what was done in the EU model. The allowances would enable these generation facilities to continue to operate, avoid a rush to gas, which would have consequences to all consumers, while new generation resources are developed. The vast majority of allowances would be allocated to the distribution company based on an even split between emissions and retail sales. By allocating to the distribution company, we ensure that the value of that allowance flows through to consumers. And that's the main point. How do we do this in a way in which we mitigate the cost impact to consumers? So, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the time to visit with you. I look forward to your questions, and particularly those around how do we make sure that consumers are not adversed by doing the right thing.
Thank you, Mr. Sturber. It was a very important proposal to put on the table for the members' consideration. Next, we welcome a former colleague and a good friend, Glenn English, who is the president of the National Rural Electric Corporation. He represented Oklahoma's 6th congressional district for many years in Congress. His organization advocates for consumer-owned cooperatives on energy and operational issues, as well as the rural community and economic development. We welcome you back to Congress. Glenn, whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that, and I do want to stress we are a cooperative. We are owned by consumers, and our focus really is to do two things. First of all, to make sure that our membership have enough power, keep the lights on, and maintain their standard of living. The second is to, of course, make sure that electric power is affordable. So that's where we're coming from. We're not for profit. We're not for profit. There are no rewards in any way for a particular fuel, so we have no fuel choice from the standpoint of generating that electric power. It all comes down to this question of the cost of power and how we can deliver that power to our membership in the most affordable manner possible. Now, Mr. Chairman, I'm speaking only from the standpoint of electricity as it applies to the bill, of course. And I would like to also call the attention of the committee to a commitment that was made years ago in 1932, first made in 32, and then reiterated several times over the next 10 years by Franklin Roosevelt, when he made the observation that in this country that electric power is no longer a luxury and had become a necessity, And I would suggest, as we move to deal with this particular issue and this challenge, that we keep that in mind, that it probably is in a little different category, perhaps, than other issues regarding carbon, food, clothing, housing, and then electricity. I think most people would agree that, in order to maintain that standard of living in this country, that's what we have to have. So anyway, I'd like to just lay out a few markers, Mr. Chairman, as we move forward to deal with this particular challenge. The first thing is, and the Dean of the House, I think, made this point some time ago about trying to regulate carbon through the Clean Air Act. I believe he described it as being a glorious mess. And I think that would probably be the case. It wasn't designed to do that. I remember I was here when we passed it the last time. I believe that was 1990, Mr. Chairman. And I remember I voted for it. I don't remember any discussion about carbon when we were talking about that. So this was not designed to do that kind of a job. So in reality, I think we all got to face the fact that we got to have a bill. But I would also suggest not just any bill. It's got to be a bill, I think, that addresses the carbon issue and the carbon issue alone. In other words, what I would suggest, it's a bill that needs to be simple, if such things can be done. It needs to be flexible. It certainly needs to be affordable. And it needs to have sustainability. And what I mean by sustainability, Mr. Chairman, is one that is going to last through the years. This is a long-term project we're embarking on, and certainly the next 10 or 15 years are probably going to be the most challenging as we move down that road. And we also need one that's effective. So I would suggest a common sense approach as we begin to put these pieces together to have a workable bill that accomplishes this objective. Next thing I would suggest is it should not be legislation that is designed to raise revenue. It shouldn't be a revenue-enhancing endeavor. It should be something that is trying to achieve the objective of reducing carbon emissions in the country, and that alone. So that means auction is not a good idea. We would discourage the committee from going down that road. That means that allowances should be free, particularly as far as applies to the electric utility industry. And we would also suggest that it should be done on the distribution level so that the full benefit of those allowances should go to consumers. And of course, our not-for-profit status, that's where they go. I would also suggest, Mr. Chairman, that as we look at the caps, they should be established with an eye toward the question of technology. What can we do and when can we do it? I think we all appreciate and understand that, that this bill, this effort, what we're going to try to accomplish here, if we're going to keep the lights on, keep electric bill affordable, we need technology, and we're going to have to make some very significant advancements, and we're very hopeful that that's going to be the case. In some cases, I guess you could say, Mr. Chairman, we're betting on the come. And we need to do everything we can to make sure that we speed up that technology and get it developed, get it online so it can be utilized so we can get back to a full complement of fuels. And we would also suggest, again, looking at it from the consumer standpoint, Mr. Chairman, that there should be some kind of safety valve device that makes certain that consumers are assured that we will, in fact, have a limit on any economic damage, that this thing won't get out of control, that we are going to try to contain those costs. I know that you've addressed that in the draft. I would suggest probably needs to be done a little different manner than what you have in the draft. Appreciate the thought. And also, as we move forward with renewables, Mr. Chairman, we are very committed to renewables. We, in fact, serve 70% of the land mass of the United States. So most of the renewable energy that's going to be generated in this country is going to be done in rural America and areas served by electric cooperatives. We've just established a national renewable cooperative, which allows small distribution systems all over the country to invest in renewable projects. But I would also suggest that there's a wide range of difference in different parts of the country. Some areas can produce renewables far more economically, far easier, and far greater magnitude than you can in other regions. And that's the reason we think it should be looked at nationally and what can be done nationally. And, Mr. Chairman, I would also suggest that for that reason there needs to be a small utility exemption, about 4 million megawatts per year. And I think we can make a serious workable start and move down the road to the objective you're trying to achieve. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. English, very much. And our next witness is Mr. Marc Crisson. He is the CEO of the American Public Power Association, which is the service organization for more than 2,000 community-owned electric utilities. Prior to his current position, Mr. Crisson was at Tacoma Power in Washington State for nearly 30 years. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. I'm Marc Crisson, President and CEO of the American Public Power Association, and as you said, we represent over 2,000 publicly owned, not-for-profit power systems across the United States, 49 states. We serve cities as large as Los Angeles, but most of our members, the vast majority of our members, serve communities of 10,000 people or less. Mr. Chairman, APPA supports congressional action to address climate change, but as my colleagues have stated, we're very concerned that achieving environmental goals be properly balanced with affordable costs to the consumer and the economy. Consequently, we've developed a detailed set of principles on implementation of a cap-and-trade program. We believe it's critically important that the transition to a low-carbon future be managed in a way that keeps electricity affordable and reliable in order to be sustainable and workable in the long term. Thus, our first principle is that legislation must include a safety valve or other stringent cost containment mechanism that sets a maximum price on carbon. While we support the inclusion in your draft bill of an offset regime and the use of banking and borrowing, we do not think these are adequate measures. We urge the committee to include a price ceiling on CO2 in the next version of your draft. We also have concerns that the provisions governing the establishment and use of offsets are inadequate for cost containment purposes and would like to work with the committee to improve these provisions. Regarding the issue of emission allowances, the electric utility sector should receive an allowance allocation proportionate to its share of total emissions, or about 40%, all of which we feel should be allocated to load-serving entities or local distribution companies. This will provide the industry with allowances sufficient to maintain reliability and affording time to adapt during the transition period when low-emission technology is under development. Allowances should go to the local distribution companies because they are in the best position to ensure that allowance revenues are used to reduce costs to electric consumers. Allocating allowances as opposed to fossil fuel generators would eliminate the prospect of windfall profits that have resulted in some cases in the European Union cap-and-trade system. We think the allocation to the LSEs is particularly important in regions that have restructured wholesale power markets that are under federal jurisdiction and run by regional transmission organizations, such as the Northeast, the Mid-Atlantic, the Greater Midwest, and California. Because allocating allowances to independent generators into these markets will raise the already high wholesale prices these markets are producing. This is because fossil fuel generators nearly always set the clearing price in the wholesale electricity supply auctions in these markets. Should they receive allowances, these fossil fuel generators will add the value of these allowances to their bids into these markets, thereby adding that cost to all other generation bidding into the market, including no or low carbon generation such as nuclear plants. EPPA also has serious concerns about auctioning allowances. An auction by its nature disadvantages small entities like most of my member systems. It's important, therefore, that if an auction is conducted, that it be designed to restrict speculation and minimize potential for volatility in allowance prices. With a stringent cost control mechanism in place, APPA would support phasing in an auction gradually over time. But without such a control mechanism, we think no auction should occur until new emissions control technology is commercially available to the industry. It's also essential that all net auction proceeds be used only for targeted research and development, energy efficiency, and mitigation of cost impact on consumers. In other words, areas directly related to addressing the climate change issue. Mr. Chairman, regarding the proposed renewable electricity standard, APPA supports a workable federal RES of 15% by 2020. However, our support contemplates that such a standard would be in place prior to implementation of a federal greenhouse gas reduction mandate and would serve to provide a bridge between the present and the time when technology has been developed to significantly capture and store carbon. We also believe that once a federal cap-and-trade program is implemented, an RES is neither necessary nor appropriate. By its nature, the RES limits the flexibility of our industry, while a cap-and-trade program is intended to provide the industry more flexibility to tailor a compliance program. Enacting the two simultaneously will increase compliance costs for many utility systems. Regarding the energy efficiency resource standard, we do not support such a standard, but would urge that the RES permit a significant percentage of the standard be met by using energy efficiency measures. Finally, Mr. Chairman, APPA has serious concerns about the new source performance standards included in Title I, because several of our members have facilities in various stages of permitting and construction. These standards would also effectively create a moratorium on coal in a post-2015 world and raise some significant challenges for facilities yet to be permitted between 2009 and 2015, because basically there's no commercially deployable coal generation technology in the U.S. that can achieve the proposed standard of 1,100 pounds per megawatt hour. We would strongly urge the committee to delete this provision. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Croissant, very much. Let me now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Barrow, to introduce our next witness.
I thank the Chair for the courtesy of allowing me to introduce our next witness. I want to welcome Mr. John Somerhalder here to the committee today. Mr. Somerhalder is the Chairman of the Board, President and CEO of AGL Resources down in Atlanta. He's a chemical engineer, been in the natural gas business for 30 years, and I think you're going to find, as he speaks for the American Gas Association today, the folks in natural gas are already doing a lot of the things we want them to do, already early starters in the area of efficiency and trying to reduce our carbon footprint. So it's a privilege for me to welcome you. Thank you, Mr. Somerhalder, for being here today.
Thank you, Congressman. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the committee.
Could you move in the microphone a little bit closer, please?
Again, thank you, Chairman.
Just a little bit closer, please.
It may not be.
Yeah.
Okay. My company has utilities, in addition to in Georgia, in Florida, Tennessee, Virginia, Maryland, and New Jersey, and natural gas storage facilities in Texas and Louisiana. I am pleased today to testify on behalf of the American Gas Association, of which I am Vice Chair and Chair of the Climate Change Task Force. The AGA's 202 members deliver natural gas to more than 171 million Americans. In terms of helping in the fight to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, natural gas utilities have two great resources, our fuel and our customers. Our fuel is a clean, efficient, abundant, and a domestic energy source, with 98% of America's natural gas being produced in the United States or in Canada. It is the dominant source of energy for residential and commercial heat, hot water, and cooking, yet it produces only about 6% of the total U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. Upon combustion, natural gas creates 43% less carbon dioxide than coal and 28% less than petroleum. In terms of our customers, they lead the nation in energy efficiency. Since 1970, the number of residential natural gas customers has increased from 38 million to 65 million, but the energy consumption and carbon emissions have remained flat in that time period. This results from a trend of declining use per customer. This dramatic reduction is attributable to tighter homes, more efficient appliances, and energy efficiency measures, many of which were implemented by natural gas utilities. Clearly, natural gas is part of the climate change solution. It offers an immediate answer with technology that is available today. The most efficient and effective way to use natural gas is directly in our homes and businesses. More than 90% of the energy that leaves the wellhead gets to the customer, rather than indirectly to produce electricity, where 2/3 of the energy can be lost. In light of the above factors, we maintain that a national programmatic focused effort, rather than a cap-and-trade effort for these customers, is the best way to ensure equity while not subjecting customers to unpredictable allowance costs. We do not want to see our customers competing with electricity generators and large industrials for the allowances necessary to heat their homes and cook their food. We believe, and history proves, that programmatic measures, uniformly applied, can accomplish what we want without the undue cost and complexities of the cap-and-trade system. However, if programmatic measures are not acceptable, AGA supports including natural gas residential and commercial sectors, excluding them from the scope of the cap-and-trade system until 2016, as proposed in the discussion draft bill. AGA believes that most allowances required for residential and commercial gas customers should be allocated rather than auctioned, as allocating allowances is the best way to ensure that price impacts on our customers will be minimized. Local natural gas utilities, as regulated by state public utility commissions, make no profit on natural gas prices when they rise. Similarly, they would not make any profit on allocated allowances. The natural gas utilities will need the ability to pass on the cost of these allowances, and the climate change bill should provide for this rate-making treatment. We support the proposed carbon footprint labeling in the draft bill. Giving customers this carbon output information will provide them with the essential information that they need to play a role in reducing our carbon output. The discussion draft bill proposes to establish an energy efficiency resource standard for both electric utilities and natural gas utilities. While the end result is a laudable one, The lack of clarity in the language addressing EERS causes concerns. First, the legislation could have the unintended consequence of limiting carbon-driven fuel switching and could even increase the nation's dependence on foreign oil by preventing conversion to high-efficiency gas applications from less efficient fuels. Second, the imposition of these penalties could be a barrier to economic growth and development by raising the cost of energy to both new and existing customers. And third, the focus is on large after-the-fact penalties rather than incentives, and it is tied to consumer behavior which the utility cannot directly control. Mr. Chairman and committee members, there are many other issues, including research and development, natural gas vehicles, and renewable gas that we don't have time to address now but are included in my written testimony. That concludes my remarks, and I will be happy to address your questions.
Thank you very much. Our next witness is Richard Morgan. He is a member of the Energy Resources and Environmental Committee of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, which represent state public service commissions that regulate utilities. Mr. Morgan also leads the NARUC Task Force on Climate Policy, and he is serving in his second term as Commissioner on the District of Columbia Public Service Commission. Please begin when you are ready, Mr. Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. My name is Richard Morgan, and I'm a member of the District of Columbia Public Service Commission. I'm testifying on behalf of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. I'm honored to have the opportunity to appear before you this morning regarding the American Clean Energy and Security Act. NARUC is on record as supporting a well-designed, economy-wide federal program to limit greenhouse gas emissions in order to remove existing uncertainties that are hampering critically needed investment in electricity transmission and generation. In concept, NARUC supports the goal of auctioning emissions allowances under a cap-and-trade mechanism. But we believe it is appropriate to provide a transitional allocation of free allowances in order to minimize economic dislocations as we move toward a 100% auction. However, as OMB Director Peter Orszag correctly points out, when allowances were given away to European power generators, shareholders, not consumers, got most of the proceeds as windfall profits. It is precisely for this reason that NARUC opposes the allocation of no-cost allowances to electricity generators. State regulators propose a different approach to ease the transition in the electric sector. Instead of giving away allowances to power generators, which are often unregulated, give them only to regulated local distribution companies which own the wires used to distribute electricity. These LDCs, as we call them, are always subject to rate-setting authorities such as state public utility commissions or consumer-owned utilities, where they can assure that consumers, not utility shareholders, receive the benefits of free allowances. In fact, state regulators already have in place mechanisms for flowing through to consumers the benefits of free emissions allowances from the existing acid rain program. President Obama has stated that reducing carbon emissions must be done in a way that insulates consumers as much as possible from potentially dramatic rate increases. Giving allowances to LDCs as a proxy for their customers provides an efficient means of softening the impact on consumers and solves the windfall profits problem at the same time. Under this approach, revenues associated with pricing greenhouse gases would be returned to the very consumers who would be at risk for paying higher energy prices. Regulators could direct a portion of the proceeds toward mitigating the impacts of pricing carbon, such as through expenditures on energy efficiency or low-income energy assistance programs. Meanwhile, generation decisions would still be influenced by the full effect of pricing greenhouse gas emissions. How the proceeds of a cap-and-trade mechanism are spent is every bit as important as putting a price on carbon in the first place. Assuming an allocation to LDCs, state regulators can direct the proceeds toward investments such as energy efficiency that reinforce the goals of limiting greenhouse gas emissions and thereby lower the overall cost of achieving emissions reductions. And you'll hear more about this from our next witness, Mr. Cowart. Mr. Chairman, you've surely noticed similarities between NARUC's proposal and those of some industry groups. In fact, EEI's testimony refers to NARUC's support for an allocation to LDCs. But that's really where the similarities end. There are some important distinctions that I want to bring to your attention. These industry groups, which have unregulated generators among their members, naturally seek an allocation of free allowances, not just for LDCs, but for merchant generators as well. NARUC objects to giving free allowances to electric generators under any circumstances, and I'd like to explain why. First, in many states, generators are unregulated, and state commissions have no way to ensure that consumers would receive the benefits of these free allowances. There's no reason to expect an outcome any different from what happened in Europe. These companies say that they need allowances to cover their so-called net compliance costs, an argument that we find curious since there is no commercial technology available to remove CO2 emissions from an existing generator. These merchant generators are not trade exposed in the sense of competing in overseas markets. They're purely domestic. Free allowances won't help to keep dirty generators operating, even if that were desirable. If carbon prices are too high, the company could simply shut down its generator and keep the value of the allowance stream for its shareholders as sort of a golden parachute. Under the formula proposed by EEI, electric sector allowances would go first to merchant generators based on historic emissions. LDCs would then get only what's left. And the generator's share could grow if the utilities decide to spin off more generators into unregulated subsidiaries. Finally, any electric sector allowances given to generators would not be available to help soften the impact of pricing carbon on consumers through their LDCs. Those who advocate an allocation to generators have not explained how this would help consumers in any way or why it would not produce a windfall for their shareholders just as it did in Europe. Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, NARUC believes that through a carefully designed cap-and-trade mechanism and appropriate distribution of emissions allowances, carbon restrictions can be implemented without undue economic burden on consumers. Thank you for your time and consideration this morning. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Morgan, very much. Our next witness, Mr. Richard Cowart, Director of the Regulatory Assistance Project. He has served as Commissioner and Chair of the Vermont Public Service Board for 13 years. He was elected President of the New England Conference of Public Utility Commissioners and was Chair of the NARUC National Committee on Energy Resources and Environment. Mr. Cowart, please begin when you are ready. If you could turn on your microphone, please.
Is that on? Yeah. Ranking Member Upton and members of the committee.
Put in a little bit closer, please.
I'll get it right there. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you this morning about the critical role of end-use energy efficiency in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and containing the cost of climate change legislation. Let me begin, Mr. Chairman, by congratulating you for the comprehensive approach you are taking to global warming pollution and the progress that Congress is making in addressing this critical issue. Given the scale of this issue, it's no surprise that climate legislation raises concerns about prices and about impacts on consumers. I've been a state environmental commissioner, public utilities commissioner, and as an advisor to many governments. So for about 25 years, I've been working to protect consumers while promoting advanced utility services needed for a modern economy. My testimony boils down fairly simply. I'm focusing on the central role that carbon credit allocation can play in protecting consumers and containing the costs of climate legislation. The good news is that a smart allocation policy linked to a smart investment strategy can greatly reduce the consumer cost of the proposed cap-and-trade program. My overall message is very simple. Congress should design the climate program to reduce emissions through greater energy efficiency, not just through higher carbon prices. For the power sector, the best way to do this is through a consumer allocation for efficiency. That is, by allocating the sector's allowances to local distribution companies or other state-supervised entities acting as trustees for consumers. The trustees can then auction the allowances to emitters and recycle the revenue for the benefit of consumers. Moreover, the best way to help consumers and to lower the cost of the entire climate program is to invest a large fraction of those funds in low-carbon resources especially cost-effective end-use efficiency. My written testimony elaborates on 4 points. I'm just going to touch on them here. First, as I've just stated, it's essential to think of climate legislation as a combination of programs, including both regulatory and market measures to lower emissions. It's not just cap and trade. It's not just a renewable electricity standard. It's not just better building codes. It's really all of the above. When California completed its exhaustive examination of this issue recently, the Air Resources Board came out with a scoping plan. At least 75% of the carbon reductions in the California plan are going to be accomplished through mechanisms that people call the complementary policies. Well, that 75% I would view as the foundation for the cap and trade program, which is intended to deliver the other 25%. My second point is that energy efficiency is the equivalent of a low-cost carbon scrubber for the power sector. And the good news is that utility-scale energy efficiency is relatively inexpensive. At 3 cents a kilowatt hour, it's much less than the cost of supply and delivery, which is usually 2 to 5 times more expensive. Efficiency opportunities exist in large quantities in all regions of the country, whether your system is a coal system, a gas system, a hydro system, any region of the country, energy efficiency resources can be tapped to benefit customers. My third point is on price impacts and cost containment. Simply put, energy efficiency is the key to cost containment in the climate legislation. Adding a price signal to the cost of electricity is useful in trying to reduce emissions, carbon emissions. But trying to meet our goals through price alone will be much more costly than a cap-and-trade program that builds efficiency right into its architecture. And this realization has 2 sides, and I want to touch on both of them. First, it's hard to get to where we want to go through carbon prices alone. People are often surprised to learn how hard it is to reduce power sector carbon through price signals. On the consumer side, it takes a very high price because of low price elasticity to actually reduce carbon as much as we need. And on the generator side, it takes a very high price in order to significantly change the dispatch across our power grids. This leads to my final point, which concerns allocations. As I've said earlier, the best way to control costs in the power sector is not by giving allowances for free to generators, but by allocating them to local distribution companies or other consumer trustees supervised by state regulators. Those trustees can sell the allowances and apply the proceeds to benefit consumers. This will deliver much more low-cost efficiency than a purely price-driven approach to allowance allocation. Our studies show that for the same dollar cost in rates, efficiency programs will save 5 to 7 times more carbon than would result from carbon taxes or credit markets alone. It's a 5 to 7 times greater savings on the environmental side for the same cost to consumers. I'll close by noting that there's a good model in the United States for the practice that I'm describing here, and that's the RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. If you look at the experience of RGGI, all 10 RGGI states considered this question and concluded that almost all the allowances should be auctioned and that almost all of, or 70% of the revenues associated with the program should be recycled back for the benefit of consumers, principally through low-cost energy efficiency. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Cowart, very much. Our next witness is Mr. Robert Greenstein, founder and executive director of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. He has had a long and distinguished career, but it included winning a MacArthur Fellowship, and he was appointed by President Clinton to serve on the Bipartisan Commission on Entitlement and Tax Reform. We welcome you back, sir. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As you know, the work of our center in this area has focused on developing proposals to protect the budgets of low and middle income consumers in a way that is effective in reaching them, efficient, and consistent with energy conservation goals. With these goals in mind, we've designed an energy refund or rebate to offset the increases in households' overall energy expenses that would result from an emissions cap, not just their increases in utility bills, which will account for less than half the overall hit to consumers' budgets. We recommend that consumer relief be provided through the tax system and existing benefit delivery systems. Under the proposal we've developed, 95% of households in the bottom fifth of the income distribution and over 98% of those in the middle fifth and the fifth in between would be reached automatically without new bureaucratic structures, no new applications required, and low administrative costs. Here's how it would work. Most households qualifying for an energy refund would get it through the form of a refundable income tax credit that would be provided in paychecks through adjustments to employer withholding, as is being done with the tax credit that you enacted in the recovery legislation in February. For seniors, veterans, and people with disabilities, they would get their refund as a direct payment from the Social Security Administration or the Department of Veterans Affairs, again is being done under the recovery legislation. And finally, very poor households participating in programs like food stamps would receive monthly energy refunds through the debit card systems that every state human service agency in the country operates to provide other low-income benefits. Those systems have proved to be efficient and highly effective. Now, some, including other of my fellow panelists here, have proposed instead routing funds for consumer relief through local utility distribution companies. While that may seem reasonable at first blush, our analysis indicates that such an approach would be unwise for several reasons. First, a utility company approach is aimed at electricity and natural gas bills. It doesn't address the full impact of an emissions cap on consumers' budgets. Over half of the impact would be in other areas: gasoline, increased prices for a whole array of goods and services that use energy in their manufacture or transportation to market. Consumer relief that only focuses on home or even business electricity and gas bills leaves consumers with a large uncompensated hole in their budgets. Secondly, this approach would cause prices for other forms of energy and energy products other than electricity and gas to rise even more, and it would increase the overall cost to the economy of meeting the cap. This is not just our conclusion. This is in the EPA study of your draft bill released this week, and it's in the study of Resources for the Future, the premier environmental think tank. The issue is that keeping utility bills low would blunt the price signal an emissions cap is supposed to send, and as a result, you'd get less reduction in electricity and natural gas use. Now, if the cap is a given amount of tons of carbon emissions, and you get less reduction from electricity and natural gas, you must get greater reduction from all other forms of energy. In order to do that, the price of other forms of energy has to rise more. In the Resources for the Future study, they estimated that this kind of an approach would cause the overall allowance price to be 15% higher than it otherwise would be. In the EPA study released earlier this week, and I'm quoting, returning the allowance value to consumers of electricity via local distribution companies prevents electricity prices from rising, but makes the cap-and-trade policy more costly overall. This form of redistribution makes cap-and-trade more costly since greater emissions reductions have to be achieved by other sectors of the economy. A third and final problem here is that while the LDCs are regulated utilities, the quality of state utility regulation is uneven across the country. And the fact that they're regulated is no guarantee that in every area of the country, free distribution of allowances to the LDCs will produce well-targeted and effective consumer relief. This is an issue some consumer organizations have expressed concerns about. So to wrap up, a refundable energy tax credit delivered through paychecks coupled with electronic benefit transfers and payments from Social Security and Veterans Affairs would be the most effective way to provide relief to low and middle income consumers. Other mechanisms would provide less consumer relief per dollar of cost, and this is why the newly formed Climate Equity Alliance has as a basic principle providing the consumer relief directly through the kind of mechanism I've described rather than through utility companies. This is an alliance that includes leading civil rights groups like the NAACP and the National Hispanic Environmental Council, leading religious organizations like the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, SEIU, and the Center for American Progress. Having said this, we all know that deadlock serves no one. We all know that agreement needs to be reached to move this legislation. So in the spirit of compromise, let me swallow hard and suggest a possible middle ground from what you're hearing on this panel.
We will give you extra time right now. That's an important, that's a very important sentence you just uttered. Thank you.
While I believe providing consumer relief through the local distribution companies is unwise for all the reasons I've mentioned, it seems that that would need to be a component of something that would move, particularly in this committee. So the suggestion would be, rather than, as some have suggested, combining a very large LDC piece and a small low-income consumer piece to supplement it, to have a somewhat more moderate LDC piece combined with a energy tax credit designed such that the sum of the LDC relief and the tax piece together fully offset the hit to the budgets of the typical middle-income household. The Social Security veterans and debit card pieces obviously would still be a part of it for those groups. And then over time, as energy efficiency and other matters kicked in over time, the free distribution of allowances to LDCs would phase down. The direct relief, the tax piece, would phase up and would stay at the level based on what was happening with energy prices that you needed to provide the consumer relief to make the typical consumer whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Greenstein. Our next witness, Dr. Robert Michaels, is a professor of economics at California State University, Fullerton. Mr. Michaels is also an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. We welcome you, Dr. Michaels. Whenever you're ready, please begin. Could you turn on your microphone, please?
There we go. Thank you, Chairman Markey. I'm honored to be here. I come from California, where we supposedly set a lot of trends, and the first thing I want to do is summarize a few problems California has that may be quite important for the content of the legislation we're talking about here. Because your legislation depends, among other things, on a national renewable portfolio standard. The thing that is clear now is that California's utilities are far out of compliance with their standard. It appears that it's going to be impossible for them to move on to tighter standards. And there are a variety of reasons, including regulatory uncertainty and citing problems with transmission. Second, the supposed effect of energy efficiency policies in California needs to be reconsidered. It's been highly touted that California's per capita electricity consumption is staying constant instead of rising like the rest of the country. What this really reflects, we can look in the statistics, it's a departure of industrial customers. Studies that show for the Air Resources Board that it's going to be a painless transition that creates jobs to California's cap and trade system. These have been thoroughly discredited by peer reviewers from places that even include the Pew Foundation. The smart grid, cost-benefit figures for the smart grid have gone in every which way in the applications in California. They've gone from negative to positive largely on the basis of assumptions that the utility will be able to control people's power in their homes. Those are important, but there's a more important thing about this bill. I think it really matters at the base. This bill is a tax bill. This bill is very anti-consumer. It has one acknowledged policy. It is to raise energy prices to Americans, and when it does so, it's going to make America less competitive in an ever more competitive world. For reasons they can best explain, Some people are on record as favoring higher prices. As important as those prices are the policies that will increase them. Every major provision of this bill is at base a tax, and every one of them is called something else. The renewable electricity standard is a cleverly disguised tax. None of it's ever going to appear on the federal books. Instead, the bill will simply force utilities to purchase renewable energy, leave state regulators with no charge but to fold the costs into households' bills. Another tax turns up in the proposed auction of allowances. The official term is auction, and again, the real term is tax. The easy way to see this, look at the plans for spending the revenue. Details aren't firm, but it's possible to go to consumer rebates, deficit paydown, health care financing. There are only two possible sources, debt and taxes, and this is a tax. Like all other taxes, allowance charges compel business owners to divert funds they could otherwise have used to operate their firms and employ people. Those who believe that the respending of revenue from auctions will create jobs have been conspicuously silent about the jobs that are going to be destroyed in the initial allocation process. The bill's effects start with scarcer energy. They hardly end there. We'll be increasing the prices of all other goods and services that use energy in their production. If that's so, we're talking lower standards of living for Americans, not higher, and talking about making American goods less desirable to foreign purchasers, not more. This bill's thrust is to make energy needlessly scarce, and then somehow we reach a conclusion that this action is good for the economy. Think of it simply. If workers work with more talented workers, they're going to be more productive than workers who labor alone. Workers with more advanced equipment to work with and more of it are going to be more productive than workers who are without it. Workers with better and more abundant energy are going to be more productive than workers who do not have access to it. This bill's logic seems to reverse all of that and tell us that less energy is going to somehow do the exact opposite of all those other things that workers work with. There's no economics in it. Scarce energy creates jobs by making workers less productive so that it takes more of them to get something done. This bill does not create prosperity. This bill is going to produce a less competitive, less productive economy that has lower incomes, less opportunity, and less wealth to hand on to future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Michaels, very much. And our final witness before questions from the subcommittee members is Mr. Darrell Bassett, spokesman for the Empower Consumers Coalition. Mr. Bassett formerly served as Arkansas State Public Utility Commission. Mr. Bassett, please begin whenever you are ready.
First of all, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee. Having been familiar, Mr. Chairman, with your body of work while I was a commissioner, I have a great deal of respect for that body of work. It's a privilege, it's an honor to be able to come to this committee and testify on what impacts we believe consumers may very well face if Congress does, in fact, adopt energy or climate policies without adequate cost containments. But I'd be remiss if I went any further without recognizing the presence on a committee of one of Arkansas's favorite sons, Congressman Mike Ross, and certainly his diligence in representing the people back home. We're awful proud of him back there. But it's an honor, it's a privilege to offer my perspective on how policies in the current draft might very well impact the poor, the elderly, the consumers on fixed incomes, those institutions of higher education, hospitals, and small businesses. These are people, members of the committee, whose story generally gets kind of lost in the wash anytime government, whether it be state or federal, considers sweeping public policy changes. And as a former utility commissioner, I'm acutely aware that the first question that consumers generally have when confronted with sweeping policy changes is, one, how much is that policy going to cost, and two, who's going to have to pay it? And personally and quite candidly, answering that second question is always easier to do than answering the first. So consequently, I want to certainly applaud the EPA for their recent analysis. I think consider it a great first step in answering that first question, which is how much is the implementation of this proposed draft going to cost the American people? However, that analysis that I've had a chance to peruse, while certainly well-intentioned, doesn't go, in my opinion, far enough given the overlapping mandates in the draft. The draft, as you know, considers mandates on renewables, energy efficiency, standards for new power plants, federal gasoline standards. There are provisions there for cap and trade and issues involving greenhouse gases. So I think it's fair to say that the consumer is going to be concerned about what the total cost of the proposal is going to be, and will certainly be less than content if we only offer them an analysis that covers cap and trade, as the EPA analysis does. There's little disagreement among consumers that the cap and trade program is going to cost them a lot of money. We're looking at studies that go anywhere from an EPA estimate of $983 billion by 2030 to one done by the American Council for Capital Formation that says it's upwards of $1 trillion. Consumers are also aware that renewables are going to be costly. What one Texas utility pays for wind recently more than doubled, and Dr. Michaels just gave you some indication about what's going on in California. They're among the nation's highest utility rates, but they also have one of the highest renewable mandates. What concerns us, quite frankly, though, is putting the two of them together. The cap and trade as well as the renewable portfolio. I believe that if we're not careful, what we could pose is potentially devastating consequences on the most vulnerable in our country, because what we're looking at when we look at that potentiality, we at Empower Consumers would then would respectfully ask that the committee, before it moves further, consider an analysis that takes into consideration all of the proposals and what their simultaneous implementation would be before passing any type of climate change or any type of renewable legislation. Our concern, quite frankly and honestly, is not with the draft. As I said initially, I'm familiar with your body of work and certainly with your reputation for integrity. That goes without saying. But what we feel, while we feel the draft is well-intentioned, we're concerned about the unintended consequences of well-intentioned legislation. And so we feel that at this critical juncture in our nation's history, we can't afford to make sweeping decisions on far-reaching legislation without a full appreciation of the extent to which our people, your constituents, are going to prosper, are going to suffer. Now, the answer to that second question that I said the consumer is going to ask, who's going to pay? Well, it's always the consumer. But the answer really, that doesn't address what they're really trying to ask, because at the heart of this thing, we know that some of those consumers are going to suffer more than others. We know that history tells us anytime we apply a one-size-fits-all approach nationally, there's going to be a disproportionate burden placed on some members across the country. And ultimately, it falls on the consumers who are least able to afford it. That's communities of color, that's the elderly, that's those living in poverty, those living on fixed incomes. They're going to pay an inordinate amount of their monthly income on energy. So I have to agree with a nonpartisan statement that came out of the Congressional Budget Office that characterized that particular effect as being regressive. It said, and I quote, "Price increases resulting from a carbon cap would be regressive. That is, they would place a relatively greater burden on low-income households than on higher-income ones." We know that in 2008, the average American family that had a disposable income of $52,500 a year last year spent 12% of that income on energy. We also know that those who were making less than $50,000, which essentially is 51% of all U.S. households, spent 24% on energy. And those making between $10,000 and $30,000 actually spent 26% of that income on energy. We also know that in 2008, African-American households, as well as Hispanic households with incomes less than $50,000, spent over a quarter of that income on energy. So it's not surprising that consumers are going to be concerned about how much more they're going to be asked to bear from any type of legislation.
If you could summarize, please, Mr. Bassett.
Well, in summary, we're concerned that the bill should address in totality all of the costs that are going to be incurred. One, we'd ask that the legislation go through a rigorous cost analysis. Second, we'd ask that you would consider mechanisms that establish some type of floor or ceiling with regard to carbon allowances so that you can mitigate any type of unintended consequences. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to testify, and Empower Consumers certainly looks forward to working with this committee as we go forward.
Thank you, Mr. Bassett, very much. Now we'll turn to questions from the subcommittee members. The chair will recognize himself, and let me turn to you, Mr. Cowart, and you, Mr. Greenstein, so that I can ask you a little bit of a question so that you can both get a chance to expand on the impact on consumers. Can you talk a little bit about what happens if we put together a good formula dealing with energy efficiency, recycling revenues, and the cost of inaction? We saw the price of a barrel of oil spike to $147 a barrel last year. If we don't put together a plan to break our dependence upon imported oil. Mr. Cowart.
I'll start. My message is plain here, that cost-effective energy efficiency is the cost containment mechanism you're looking for. And I encourage all the subcommittee members to look really carefully at all the mechanisms in this legislation that would promote end-use energy efficiency. And I suspect that Mr. Greenstein and I are going to agree that that is one of the ways to bring prices down across the board for everybody. And secondly, that in particular, we should support targeted low-income energy assistance that would direct cost-effective energy efficiency, particularly to low-income families, through such things as dramatically expanding the weatherization programs. So there are a lot of mechanisms here to help consumers both directly and indirectly by lowering carbon prices and lowering power prices through aggressive energy efficiency actions.
Okay, let me go to you, Mr. Greenstein.
I think things like energy efficiency and consumer relief go hand in hand. The way that we think of and the way we recommend you think of, and I think the way the committee, as I understand it, is thinking of consumer relief, is that the consumer relief be related to some share of the permits. The more effective that efficiency and shifts to alternative forms of, cleaner forms of energy via the price signal are, then the less will be the amount that the allowances sell for, and the smaller will be the hit on consumers' budgets. I don't think this bears one way or another on the form of the consumer relief, but under the proposal that I've suggested with tax credits, payments from Social Security, and veterans, and the debit card mechanism, the amount of the rebate would be tied each year to the price that the allowances were selling for, and thereby to the overall impact on consumers. So the better the better the results one gets from investments in efficiency and alternative energy, the less the burden both on the overall economy and on consumers. And if X% of the permits are going for consumer relief, the dollar amount of that relief will be less because the impact on their budgets will be less because the efficiency is working.
Thank you, Mr. Greenstein. Mr. Sturber, in my home state of Massachusetts, there are two large coal-burning power plants, the Salem plant and the Brayton Point plant. Since our state required utilities to spin off these plants as part of its restructuring plan, they are not subject to rate regulation by the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities. If we were to give Dominion Power, which owns Salem, and PGE, which owns Brayton Point, free allocations, what would prevent them from pocketing that financial windfall rather than passing on the savings to the consumer?
Mr. Chairman, the primary benefit that will go to those consumers is the allocation that would be made to the LDC that serves the consumers in that area. The purpose of a small allocation, and we're talking about less than 10% of the total allocations to the electricity sector that would go to coal generators. The purpose of that is to help cover the costs that are not recovered by that coal generator through the price of electricity caused by the imposing of a cap and trade. So it helps cover that small component of cost that is not recovered through the market price. Yes, they will sell it. Yes, that generates revenue to them. What it does do, and let me use Texas where I'm more familiar, Mr. Chairman, because I operate there, is it helps ensure that that coal resource stays viable for a period of time, because the allowances that are allocated to that generator would decline. But it helps ensure that you don't end up causing that unit to be shut down or mothballed and replaced with gas generation.
Okay, let me go to, if I may, Mr. Morgan, do you agree with that?
Well, I agree in part that the benefits to consumers come through the allocation to the LDCs, but I don't see how the consumer gets any benefit from giving free allowances to the generator, because those benefits are, we have no way to make sure that they get passed along. The company, in fact, wouldn't necessarily even keep that plant operating. If it becomes uneconomic because carbon is being priced, the allowance allocation is based on the baseline, and they would get this perpetual stream of allowances into the future even if the plant has been retired. So there really isn't any incentive for them to even keep the plant running, and there's every opportunity for them to pass along the value of that future allowance stream to the shareholders, and really no way for it to get to the
My time has expired. We have to continue this conversation, I think. My time has expired. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you know, a number of states are actually exceed 90% of their power is produced from coal. And I have always been a supporter of clean coal technology. And Mr. Sturba, you indicated that you thought that there should be free allowances until technology is in place that will actually reduce those emissions. I was a co-sponsor of the voucher bill last year. I hope that we can proceed on it this year. But if it works, and I hope that it does, it's still 8 or 10 years probably away before it's actually in place and you can actually see it begin to be implemented with a number of different facilities around the nation, particularly in the Midwest. So assuming that that's all accurate, you would want a free allocation until that technology is on the shelf ready to use. Is that right?
Yes, sir. In fact, I think that free allocations, in order to help mitigate consumer impact, should last longer than just 8 to 10 years. I think, but they would be declining as the cap declines. So to me, you should be thinking about allocations that would last 20 to 30 years, but it's a declining amount, and that's for the consumer protection purposes.
Yeah. Now, as we talk about consumers getting money back, in essence, a rebate, our state, Michigan, my state, Michigan, we've lost 150,000 jobs in the last number of months. Estimates that were released earlier this week by the University of Michigan show we're going to lose more than 230,000 before the end of the year. We already provide 79 weeks of unemployment benefits, and you might have seen the news this morning that GM is suspected of closing all of their facilities, or virtually all of them, for 9 weeks beginning next month, which will impact even more than what was shown by the U of M. I know that there's a lot of thoughts about rebating consumers. Of the panel here, how many believe that consumers also should be employers eligible for such rebates that you might impose, as Mr. Greenstein indicated, for those Mr. Sturba. Anyone else that believe that employers should be able to receive rebates as well as individuals? Just two? Or can I have a show of hands? Three? Mr. Morgan, you're a no then, is that right? Mr. Greenstein, are you a no?
My sense is the most efficient way to do this is employers will have some increased costs that they'll pass through to consumers. And the system I recommend, this is part of the impact on consumers that would be compensated.
Okay. Mr. English, you indicated that you were looking for an out. Was it 4 million megawatts? Is that what it was?
Well, suggesting that as far as small utilities are concerned, that's what Small Business Administration identifies as a small utility exemption. So, yes, I would suggest that on the renewable electricity standard.
Okay, and what is the average renewables now? I support renewables, wind, solar, whole number, hydro. What is the average of your members in terms of membership, in terms of what they now provide for renewables? Or what percentage?
Well, I think it depends on what you define as renewable. That's part of the difficulty we have. Different states have different definitions. What we would include, which would include hydro, is about 11%. And you're talking about roughly, we use about 9% of the power that electric cooperatives use does come from renewable energy that's hydro.
So if you include a broader base, include hydro, include a whole number of waste to energy, do you support the 25 by 25?
Well, I'm a member of the steering committee of the group known as 25 by 25 that has that as an objective, and I think that does come down as to how flexible you're going to be, how inclusive. Let me also add very quickly, there's another problem here, and that is if we're going to produce renewable energy on a large scale, and we would advocate that that's what needs to be done if we're going to meet these standards, that the one thing that you're going to have as a part of this legislation is siting.
Well, that's my last question. I've got 28 seconds. I want to come back to a degree with Mr. Morgan, Mr. Cowart. There is nothing, as I read this bill, as we look at renewables. We've had a problem in California. I support renewables, whether they be off Nantucket or whether they be in Lake Michigan for wind. With that also comes the siting or the connection to the transmission lines. We've seen a pretty vocal struggle in California where the senior senator there has announced that the Mojave Desert should not be a place for solar. We've seen off San Diego, a major solar park being the transmission lines trying to be sued by the Sierra Club. Is there a length of time that the local PUCs should make a decision before FERC comes in with a heavier hand?
I think it's going to have to be very, very short time if, in fact, we're going to meet these objectives. That's the whole point. If you're going to have a carbon cap on it and we're going to rely heavily on renewable energy, we've got to have siting and have it very, very quickly. And I would suggest that that has to be focused primarily on renewable energy on the building that high voltage transmission.
Mr. Morgan, you agree?
Yes, if I could add, the amount of time available for commissions to review, first of all, we don't see any evidence that that's a problem right now. There are many other problems associated with siting transmission lines. A lot of the problems, particularly in the West, have been associated with siting lines across federal land. And we do, in fact, have legislation in place now that provides a federal backstop where commissions don't act within a certain amount of time. NARUC would prefer to give a chance for this law to work. We don't see any evidence that it's not working. And we are, in fact, open to discussions about further changes in transmission policy, but we would like to see the current law given a chance to work.
Okay, gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sturba, Mr. Morgan stated that he's opposed to allowances for merchant generators. I wonder if you would like to explain why you think it's important to allocate credits to merchant generators as called for in the U.S. CAP report.
Yes, sir. Thank you. First, I only believe that it's appropriate to allocate to some merchant generators. In the typical markets in the United States, natural gas sets the market clearing price. So that included in that price will be the cost of allowance for natural gas. Natural gas emits about 50% of the carbon that a coal plant emits. So part of that 50% is already being reflected in the price. The only thing we are proposing in this, in this comment I will represent both EEI and USCAP, is the coverage of the other 50% for unregulated coal generation. If we do not maintain for a period of time that level of unregulated coal generation, which represents about 16%, 17% of all generation in the United States, we run the risk of a switch and a rush to gas, which will increase natural gas prices for all consumers. That's a very hidden cost that is real. And we've seen what happens when natural gas prices move from $4, $5, $6 to $14, $15, $16.
How do you feel about that clarification, Mr. Morgan?
Well, first of all, having those allowances available, which are based on the baseline, does not provide an incentive to keep that plant running. If the plant is not economic because of pricing carbon, the most efficient thing for the company to do is shut the plant down and keep the allowances, and you'll have the rush to gas anyway. Really what it is just, it's, as I said earlier, it's kind of a golden parachute for these old dirty plants to help cover their obligations to their shareholders. It's not going to keep the plants running. It's not going to help solve that problem.
Mr. Doyle, if I could, and this is a personal statement, as an owner of unregulated coal generation in Texas, if I don't have a plant running, I shouldn't get allowances. I agree with that.
All right. Let me ask you also, Mr. Sturba, the draft calls, the draft text calls for alternative compliance payments to be set at 5 cents per kilowatt hour. How does that affect your membership in the real world? What would the effect of that be?
Well, the effect is to increase cost. I believe that somewhere in the 2.5 cent alternative cost is appropriate. I think 5 cents imposes a heavy burden on consumers. One of the biggest concerns I've got is that we will do the right thing by putting in place carbon legislation, but we do it in a way in which electricity prices increase to a point where we get a consumer backlash. We've seen it happen in California, in the California kerfuffle of 2001. We've seen it happen elsewhere where things happen and consumers respond by saying no more. We need to do this smartly, and if we create systems that cause prices to go up too much too fast, we'll get that consumer backlash.
Mr. Cowart, many of us on the panel here have concerns that the 25% renewable standard is going to be very difficult to meet in certain regions of the country. And one of the ideas, one of the ways to lessen that burden would be to expand the list of qualifying energy sources, to recognize things such as methane recovery and waste to energy and distributed generation. What are your thoughts on expanding the list of qualifying energy sources to meet a 25% standard?
Well, with respect to the list you just gave, I support it. I think that there are good reasons to expand certainly the qualified renewables to include methane conversion, which is, as you know, from a global warming perspective, that's a double winner and definitely ought to be encouraged. I think that there's some merit to allowing a piece of a renewable portfolio standard to be met by accelerated achievement in energy efficiency as well. As a general matter, we like to keep them separate, and there are good reasons for that. But for some regions of the country where they think that it's going to take longer to get the renewables going, allow some efficiency, early action on efficiency to qualify.
And just a final question, because I just have 7 seconds left, just a show of hands. How many on the panel would support a 100% auction of these credits?
Now or later?
Now, well, of course later, but right now. Just one? Okay, I see my time is up, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, the ranking member of the full committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure where to start. I guess I'll start by complimenting Mr. Sturba. It's good to see you when I walked in, you kind of changed your look. I thought I was looking at Ming the Magnificent of Flash Gordon, so, which is a good look, not a bad look.
I appreciate your taste, sir.
Yeah, let me just start out by clarifying something that our distinguished subcommittee chairman said. One of the reasons we're apparently doing this bill is to become less dependent on imported oil, which I support, the goal. How much imported oil is used in the generation of electricity among the member companies of EEI?
Mr. Barton, I don't recall the specific number. It's fairly small.
It's close to zero.
It might be in the 1% range.
Yeah. So we're not going to get a lot out of this bill because the imported oil is going for the transportation industry. It's not going for the power generation industry.
That's correct, and I think that's where plug-in hybrids come in for the future.
Yeah. Well, speaking of plug-in hybrids, hybrids are made in my district down in Arlington, Texas. The additional cost of the hybrid is such that it never pays for itself. At $4 a gallon gasoline, it took somewhere between 10 to 15 years. At $2 gasoline, you're buying a hybrid just because you want to buy a hybrid. There's no payback to it. And in any scenario, the GM plant in my district that makes the GMC hybrid, the Cadillac hybrid, they have the capacity to make approximately 60 per hour. In the entire country, I'm told they're selling about 30 a week. So let's don't kid ourselves. Unless we force America, and I mean force them, this theology that everybody's going to transit to an electric vehicle or a hybrid vehicle, unless it's mandated by federal law backed up by the Army, it's not going to happen. I do want to thank you, Mr. English, for reminding the committee of jurisdiction that when we passed the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, which I voted for too, we explicitly didn't include CO2. It wasn't serendipitous that we just kind of forgot about it. We debated it and thought about it, and we didn't think that CO2 was a pollutant and needed to be regulated as a criteria pollutant under the Clean Air Act. The Republican alternative is going to, when we put it out for this bill, is going to have a provision from Congresswoman Blackburn, a member of the committee, that explicitly states that, which is something that I think the committee members need to keep in mind. Mr. Michaels, I want to ask you a question since you talked a little bit about cost. Could you explain to the committee and to me how raising the price of any commodity, in this case CO2, can be absorbed without being passed on to anybody in the economy, which is apparently what my friends on the other side think they can do?
The fundamentals of supply and demand say that no matter what kind of increase in price, increase in tax there is, there's going to be part of it is going to be borne by consumers. Part of it may be borne by producers, by consumers as higher prices, by producers as having lower profits, fewer funds that they can reinvest in their businesses. The exact details of how the numbers break down in the carbon case is a subject of considerable debate, and certainly in California they haven't settled that issue yet.
But let's assume that by some miracle, Mr. Doyle, my good friend, can come up with an allowance system that doesn't cost anybody anything. Then there's no reason to use less of the commodity that's being capped, is there, if there's no cost to it?
But the only way that could happen would be if allowances were redundant and it was as good as if they didn't exist at all.
Well, my time's about to expire, Mr. Chairman. I do want to compliment you. Yesterday I learned that the oil and gas in Alaska is there as a result of continental plate shift. And I'm sure that I may learn something of a similar value as this hearing progresses with the other 20 witnesses that we have today. So I'm going to yield back the balance of my time.
Thanks, gentlemen. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Anderson.
Thank you. I'm glad my friend Mr. Barton mentions Alaska because as we speak, The tundra of Alaska is melting because of carbon dioxide. The polar ice cap is disappearing because of carbon dioxide. The oceans that sustain the salmon fishery of Alaska are becoming much more acidic because of carbon dioxide. So I just want to ask you a preliminary question, to the extent I hope you can answer yes or no pretty much to this question. I want to just ask each of you very quickly to answer this. Do you believe that the threats associated with the pollutant carbon dioxide and the threats of changing the climate and the acidity of our oceans are significant enough to the United States that we should endeavor to cap, to limit the amount of this pollution in the atmosphere, Mr. Sturba?
Yes.
I think we're doing it no matter what.
Yes, Mr. Congressman.
Yes, Mr. Congressman.
Yes, NARUC supports taking federal action to reduce carbon emissions.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Science is not yet clear enough to make a decision on the
Could you turn on your microphone so we could hear this?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
The science is not yet clear enough to make a decision on as drastic a policy as this.
Yes.
The reason I ask that question is that we have two very significantly different approaches. One side of this committee believes that this problem demands action. One side believes that this is not a problem and therefore has not proposed any action to deal with this problem. So I take the majority of your answers to be that these industries suggest we need action. And there has been, and there will be much criticism of the proposal we have made to take action on this problem. But we have made a proposal. We have stepped up to the plate to suggest one cause of action. We have come up with ideas on how to solve this problem. And simply sniping at this particular proposal, although in the finest American tradition, is not going to help us solve this problem. And I look forward to one day where all members of this committee can start being part of the solution rather than being part of the problem and not taking any action. So I want to ask about the action that we should take. First, a question I want to ask is, could someone help us on the best way to assist the siting of transmission? I do believe in this bill there are some additional measures we should consider, that as these renewable sources start to come online with concentrated solar, offshore wind, we are going to see a significant increase for need for transmission lines, and I think we need some backstop federal authority to site those. I'll turn to Mr. English for his thoughts in this regard.
Well, thank you very much, and let me just say I would respond that we've got a more practical situation in front of us right now. I think the Clean Air Act is going to be used to address this issue, and I think that this committee and the Congress needs to make sure that we have something that is deliberately passed to address the carbon issue. Second is renewables have got to play a huge role in this thing, and from a practical standpoint, we've got to move very rapidly if, in fact, this legislation is going to be timely as far as, and I think that's what you intend.
Yeah, are you when you say move rapidly, you're referring to transmission?
I'm particularly transmission. I think efficiency, we've got to be very aggressive on it, and quite frankly, I don't think we're anywhere close to what we need to be done on that. Second thing, I think as far as transmission is concerned, I understand, not in my backyard, I don't want any part of it, but quite frankly, if given the amount of reliance that I expect that we're going to have on renewable energy and what I think probably the authors of this bill intend, we have to have that siting, and probably we need the siting yesterday, not tomorrow, not 2 years from now, not 5 years. We cannot build the renewable energy that's going to be necessary to move this country forward and to even approach 15% or 20%, much less 25%, unless that siting is done within the next 2 years.
We'll be making some suggestions to the committee about how to move that forward in future drafts of the bill, and we hope any and all of you could help us with your insights on how to draft that. Very quickly, as we recycle the money from the auction proceeds, and I do believe there should be 100% or high level of auction except for the permits that Mr. Doyle and I have fashioned a measure to go back to energy intensive manufacturing industries. But as we recycle that, what is the best way to do it if we want to encourage the use of those recycled dollars back to consumers to use it for efficiency improvements? Is it just increasing the weatherization program, or should we have some voucher program? Take about a 20-second answer if the chair will allow from someone. I'm going to go Mr. Cowart.
We need an entire suite of energy efficiency programs. It includes weatherization. It includes assistance to industries. It includes assistance for retooling factories. It includes commercial energy efficiency as well. The local distribution companies or other trustees appointed by and supervised by state regulators are the best means to ensure that these dollars are returned to customers in the form of enhanced efficiency.
Mr. Greenstein, I'm kind of out of time. I want to respect the chair's
quickly, Mr. Greenstein.
I was just going to say, in terms of consumers' efficiency investments, you're going to get consumers investing more in home efficiencies themselves if they see the price signal in their utility bills and they are made whole by a direct payment, so they still see the. If you artificially keep the bill down, there's going to be less incentive for them to themselves take conservation and efficiencies.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Walton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First question I have for each of you, and I want a yes or no answer. Have you read the draft discussion bill yourself in its entirety? Mr. Bassett?
Yes.
Mr. Michaels? No. Mr. Greenstein?
In its entirety, no. Parts of it, yes.
Mr. Cowart?
Same answer.
Mr. Morgan?
Same answer.
Same answer.
Not entirely.
Not entirely.
Not entirely.
Thank you. I haven't either, but I'm just about there. 648 pages, and I think I'm down to about 603 right now. The reason I ask that is not to put you on the hot seat, except that our job here is to legislate. So every word matters, despite what my colleagues on the other side may think, that we're not supposed to ask questions. I intend to ask questions, and I intend to pursue this pretty aggressively because I think we're about to put into law a policy that will have enormous ramifications for consumers, small businesses, every American, and our future. And so I am going to take my time, and I may invoke my rights under the House rules, which cannot be superseded by this committee, to get 5 minutes for each of you for questions, because I think it's that important of an issue. So let's start out. Mr. English, I appreciate your testimony today and your work on behalf of the Rural Electric Co-ops. You have a very good organization, and I've worked closely with the members in my district. Explain to me how the provisions in this bill affect your members, a lot of them very small little cooperatives out across very rural landscapes, when it comes to them participating in an auction. Can you explain to me how they compete with a 5-member board or a 10-member board out in Hood River or John Day or somewhere?
We don't think even our largest members can compete in that kind of an environment in an auction. It would be extremely difficult for us to do so. And let me also say that doesn't even take into account the regional ramifications of an auction.
And yet in the Northwest, we have enormous wind energy. A lot of it in my district. I'm proud of it. But I also know that one of the great synergistic actions there is being able to use the hydro system as a storage battery. There are provisions in this legislation that both completely discriminate against hydroelectric power as renewable, if it was online prior to 2001, as well as any new hydro is not considered renewable if in some way it affects the pool level behind a storage facility at any time or any location. Doesn't that pretty much rule out new hydro as a battery for wind?
I think it is a mistake to eliminate any kind of renewable whatsoever. We are looking at biomass. We're looking at all different aspects of generating renewable energy. But again, I want to go back that the biggest limitation on renewable energy is transmission and is the question of siting.
I'm going to bring this up again. This is Bonneville Power's hourly measurements of wind energy in the Northwest. And you see the dramatic drop in output of wind. You have to have something to balance it out. We're going to move forward with renewable energy, which is a good thing, but it cannot be done in a vacuum. So can somebody explain to me how you do not need other power sources that you can bring online rapidly to balance this out? The same would go with solar at night.
I'll just say very quickly, you're right.
Appreciate that. Let's talk about natural gas. Does anybody believe here that this legislation will not drive up the cost of natural gas?
For the reasons that were mentioned earlier, clearly, even your example related to intermittent sources of power from renewable, that will require generation that can back it up. Natural gas is the quickest source of new facilities that can come on the quickest to back that up.
And so everybody's agreeing, yes, natural gas price. Anybody disagree? And I don't mean to move fast, but I'm down to a minute. Smart grid. I'm going to go back to Mr. English on this. As I read this legislation, everybody that serves a power customer is going to have a plan put in place rather rapidly on how to deal with plug-in hybrids and a smart grid technology. Now, out in Fossil, Oregon, there's one person for every 9 miles of power line. Can you explain to me if there's a cost associated with that smart grid technology and that plug-in requirement here and how that would be addressed?
Well, first of all, let me just say that we don't...
And I drive hybrids, by the way, despite my ranking members.
Right. First of all, we don't have a clear definition of what smart grid means. Second, we're very proud, of course, electric cooperatives seem to be well in advance of the rest of the industry, according to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in this area. Third is we think the very need for efficiency is going to drive a good deal of new technology. And fourth, you have to have flexibility to address the kind of situations that you have locally.
Mr. Chairman, I realize my time for this round has run out. I would encourage you each to read this bill in its entirety, word for word, because every word in this bill has an enormous impact. And I can't wait till we get into trying to figure out biomass, which is, if it comes off of federal land, is not renewable, and probably not even off private forest land, and why municipal solid waste converted into energy is not renewable. There are a lot of questions here, Mr. Chairman, and I hope we get time to ask them.
I thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Matsui.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The main electric utility in my district is the Sacramento Municipal Utility District, popularly known as SMUD. It consistently receives high marks of customer satisfaction while investing significantly in energy efficiency and renewable energy development. SMUD supports a transparent cap and trade system to get greenhouse gases under control. It has also undertaken a number of positive and voluntary programs that have helped people control their energy usage and increase the amount of energy they use from renewable sources. SMUD is highly supportive of allocating emission allowances directly to the LDCs, of which SMUD is one. The idea behind this is that LDCs are able to pass potential savings directly onto their ratepayers while avoiding windfall profits. Mr. Sturba, I know that SMUD agrees with you that allocation should be distributed directly to LDCs. I know this is one of the main issues that this committee will have to deal with before marking up the draft legislation before us. So I'd like to delve a little bit more deeply into the details. SMUD tells me that giving allowances directly to LDCs will protect against windfalls to generators and eliminate opportunities for market manipulation. Why do you think that LDCs are in a better position than anywhere else along the energy supply chain to protect the consumer welfare and guard against windfall profits?
The distribution company is, in our instances, for shareholder-owned utilities, are regulated. The regulator is familiar with how to handle the costs and the benefits of trading in allowances. It's done today relative to SOX and in many instances NOx. So we have proven mechanisms by which those benefits from an allowance are flowed through to customers. And I know that that would continue to exist.
Let's assume for a moment that some of the emission allocations under this bill will be auctioned. In the case of an auction, is it your opinion that LDCs should also receive the lion's share of the auction revenue to pass through to the ratepayers?
In the instance that for the allocated share of allowances associated with electric generation, as it is allocated, as that auction moves on, I believe the Congress should consider providing the value of those allowances cash, if you will, back to the regulated entity to help mitigate impact if it chooses not to do an allocation. The much simpler way is to allocate and allow the Commission in each state to oversee how those values are provided back to consumers.
Okay, just to follow up on that, we need to ensure as much as discretionary auction revenues go toward complementary policies to mitigate and adapt to climatic change. How are the LDCs positioned relative to other entities in the supply chain to ensure that the auction revenue is spent on activities that will reduce further global warming, emissions, weatherization, renewables, efficiency, et cetera?
I think there are certainly other things that can be done with proceeds resulting from auctions. For example, in helping ensure there's a very robust weatherization program. The use of those funds to invest in technology. If what we're about is creating a mechanism or a set of mechanisms to reduce our carbon footprint, why should not all of the value that's associated with imposing these costs on the economy be used for that purpose?
Okay, in your testimony, you referenced the oil fund payment that Alaskans receive every year. I was thinking about the Alaska situation earlier this week, and it seems to me that returning money directly to consumers in this way might sound good politically, but would create problems down the line when the emissions cap starts to drive down the amount of revenue generated from the cap and trade program. How can we best ensure that consumers are assisted with temporary higher energy costs without making them dependent on a rebate payment from the federal government?
The absolute simplest way is to provide an allocation to the LDC such that that cost is never incurred by the consumer. Prices, I agree with Mr. Cowart that prices don't drive everything. And so having that allocation made to the LDC such that that cost is not passed back on to consumers is the best appropriate strategy.
Okay, so the role that the LDCs play in ensuring the allocation revenues, you can really believe the LDCs can really play an effective role in essence, in the allocation revenues?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Looks like my time is almost up, so thank you.
Great. Gentlelady's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a great start to start really hashing out the numbers as we tried to address yesterday. And I would appeal to the chairman that once they decide on a mark, that we have a hearing on the numbers. I also appeal to the chairman that I know you want to move this fast, that enough time is given for everyone to score this out. And let me just ask that to the panel. I did this yesterday. Do you agree that transparency is better than the lack of transparency in this process? Everyone agree with that? Everybody shaking their head yes. Would it be better for us to know the numbers that are proposed a week prior to the markup of a bill? Does everyone agree with that? Transparent process? Everyone agree? Mm-hmm. Yes, everybody shaking their head yes? Mm-hmm. I'm assuming everybody's shaking their head yes. No one is willing to go on record saying, no, we'd rather not have a full and a transparent process, at least a week amount of time. Should we have time and a full transparent process and time to allow people who are making the economic analysis, the numbers, so that a proper economic analysis of the impacts, good or bad, those that will help move to a green economy and those that may, does everybody agree that that should be part of this process, a full, transparent, regular order process so we can debate this? Anyone disagree with that? So everyone is agreeing, Mr. Chairman. So I would hope that in this, and there's great divergent opinions, and we've got a lot of committees and a lot of processes, the marker's really down for these numbers to be laid out in time for us to really have a credible debate. Now, why is this important? It's important because there's going to be job losses. There's a supposition that there'll be job gains. There are some people claiming that there will be an equal amount of job losses to job growth. I reject that proposal. I think the Spanish study also rejects it. For every 1 job created, there were 2 jobs lost. And so we will continue to focus on job creation. Why is this important to me? You all talked about the Clean Air Act, the 90 amendments. We cannot use the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments and say that the cap and trade provision on a small amount of emittance with available technology is related to the huge amount of captured emittance, if you want to call carbon dioxide, and the inability to have any technology to do it at this time. Peabody Mine number 10, Kincaid, Illinois. Fuel switching, Mr. Chairman, that's what this natural gas debate is. Fuel switching cost 1,200 mine workers, United Mine Workers jobs in one coal mine. And the commodity was switched. There was a fuel switch. These guys lost their jobs. Done poorly, with no transparency, you're going to have fuel switching, and I'm going to lose more. The number I like to use was even more, and they came out in our hearings with the chairman's, to the chairman's credit. We had the Ohio Mine Association here a couple weeks ago. You know how many mine workers' jobs were lost during the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments in Ohio? 35,000 mine workers' jobs. Now, what does that mean to rural America? For this piece of coal from Willow Creek Mine, underground employment, 411 miners. The prep plant has 51. This is just mine. 462 jobs. This is in rural, poor, southeastern Illinois. The total economic impact for this one mine in poor, southeastern Illinois is $123 million. That's money that goes to the local schools, to the local roads, to the local county, to hire sheriffs. That's what's endangered if we don't do this right. If we're going to fuel switch to natural gas, these jobs are lost. Natural gas is high, especially, Mr. Chairman, if we don't move to more exploration, location, and recovery of natural gas emissions. Appreciate your panel. The fight continues. I yield back my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, the issue of allowances is really at the heart of cap and trade. It's difficult and it's politically difficult. So I appreciate the diversity of opinions that are expressed here this morning. And I think this panel represents the diversity of the opinions of the American public. So if we can work in the face of this diversity to find something that's passable by this committee and by the House, I think we'll have something that'll be beneficial and it'll work. Personally, I believe in terms of allocations, that we should go as far upstream as possible, but I realize that politically, for a number of legitimate reasons, that isn't going to happen. And so I appreciate the spirit of compromise shown by Mr. Greenstein in biting your tongue and saying, well, okay, we'll work with the LDC. So I hope that the committee can work in that spirit and find a legislation that we can live with. Now I have a couple of questions. Mr. Sturba, I think your presentation was very good. I appreciate that. I lived in New Mexico for many years, so I understand the situation. We've seen, though, in the past, a recent past, the opponents of clean energy crying wolf in the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, and to a lesser degree with the Montreal Protocol, and yet those catastrophic predictions were never borne out. And in fact, we saw a good benefit at very little cost. So I'd like to ask you what you think made these estimates so wrong, and what lessons can we learn from that experience?
I think in the instance of the Clean Air Act amendments for sulfur dioxide, for example, it is that And the point that was made by Mr. Shimkus is true. There were technologies that could be used, and what happened is that they ended up costing a lot less than people assumed. And it's the power of a market, and that's the value, I think, of a cap-and-trade system, is it capitalizes on that power of a market to drive the costs for compliance down. So where $3,000 was an expected value for the cost of an allowance, turned out to be $300. So I think that's one of the things we want to capture. The difference here is there are some new technologies that must be developed, carbon capture and storage, to ensure that it is available, and that's what we have to get to.
Well, thank you. One of the things that's sticky in California particularly is that we've invested a lot in efficiency, and how do we get credit for that early efficiency? Mr. Cowart, could you take a stab at that? How could we give credit in allowances for this?
There are actually two answers to that question. First is the good news. And the good news is that as I talk to people in California, they think they have an advantage in an environment that, such as the one we're entering, because in California you know how to do energy efficiency, and that actually you're not disadvantaged by the fact that you have in place the human capital and the experience to do the job. But to answer your question directly, it's through the selection of a baseline period for the allocation to LDCs. We're proposing an allocation to LDCs in part based upon consumption levels, and it's important that that selection of consumption level be done in such a way as to reward successful performance over time in the delivery of efficiency. So that if you're successful tomorrow, for example, in delivering efficiency to your customers, that next year your allocation doesn't go down just because of that. And the same thing could be said in terms of backcasting to a baseline.
Thank you. You know, the Edison Electric Institute is leading the effort in terms of small grid, and I appreciate that because I spent many years in 1990s developing a smart grid, a utility meter for residential use. So I think there's potential there. One of the things that I think gives the greatest potential is the marrying smart meters with hybrid vehicles. Could you comment on that, Mr. Serbo?
Well, smart meters are a part of the smart grid, and it's an essential component of it that allows communication to occur in two directions instead of only just in one. And we absolutely, in order to facilitate plug-in hybrids, which today have a cost disadvantage, but frankly, I personally believe that will change dramatically over time, we have to be able to help ensure that those vehicles can not just be users of electricity, but also storers of electricity for the benefit of the grid. And that means that you have to have a meter or the capacity to measure electricity going both ways and to communicate price signals so that the ability for someone who owns a plug-in hybrid to support the grid can be recognized on an economic basis.
Thank you. It looks like my time's expired.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Michaels, we often hear that California is a leader in climate change policy. You testify that people using California as an example of effective energy efficiency policy have an untenable case. Would you elaborate on that?
Well, I just went through several basic points about it. Yes, there are some California energy efficiency programs that have delivered. But as a simple fact, the California Energy Commission has always looked at projected resource needs in the future, and they have almost invariably overestimated what the likely contribution of efficiency is going to be.
If you could look at the policy of California on climate change, what would be the main lesson that we could draw from California utility policies?
It's infinitely more complicated than anyone could imagine, and there's no precedent for it. Everybody who talks about using some model to get numbers, the bad news is you're talking about something unbelievably complex, as much so as the whole economy plus the whole ecosystem. We don't know how to do this. The projections you get, if you look at the federal figures, use models from the Energy Information Administration, which itself has shown what incredibly poor predictors of things they are in its own documents.
some of your fellow panelists advocate different types of allocation schemes to protect consumers. Are there any schemes that will truly insulate consumers and small businesses from the cost impacts of this cap and trading scheme?
How could there be? After all, what you're doing is making something that was formerly free, namely the right to emit carbon, scarce. All you've done is you've increased the cost of doing business for businesses. You've increased the cost of living for consumers ultimately, because some of that's going to be passed on to them. There's no way to insulate the entire economy or even a major segment of it from as massive a scarcity as we're thinking about creating here.
Now, you said, Dr. Michaels, every major provision of this bill is at base a tax. Would you elaborate on that? Why is the renewable electricity standard a tax, for instance?
The renewable electricity standard is not a federal tax that's going to be explicitly paid to this government. But what it is it's a mandate upon states that their utilities catch a certain fraction of their power from renewables over the course of time in the future. Renewables are not cost effective now. We don't know when, if ever, they're going to be. Even wind, which is the most common renewable, and renewable is almost a synonym for wind, still is not cost effective without a federal subsidy, production tax credit, and accelerated depreciation. We're talking about people's electric bills rising because regulators have to fold these costs in for regulated utilities. That's as good as a tax.
From your understanding of the issue, Dr. Michaels, would imposing this tax on energy lead to any meaningful global emissions reductions?
I'm not an expert on that, but I'm aware that as a fraction of global emissions, the U.S. is relatively small. And my understanding, and I'm not an expert again, is that it's going to take a much larger increase than is ever contemplated in this legislation to make a dent in it.
Now, you say the bill will have massive effects on both consumers and small businesses. Does anyone on the panel disagree with that? Mr. Cowart?
Well, I'll disagree to this extent. To the degree that we're smart about how we implement it, and to the degree that we recycle revenue that advances highly efficient technologies, the impacts on consumers and businesses can be quite moderated.
I think the impact is going to be disproportionate, and that's why I've underscored any approach should be an approach that recognizes regional differences. Obviously, some consumers in certain parts of the country are going to be disproportionately impacted because of their coal dependency, and so any formula needs to take that into consideration.
Mr. Greenstein, you wonder?
It all depends on how the legislation is designed. Well-designed legislation that makes appropriate use of auction proceeds and permit allocations, as I've indicated, can hold low and middle income consumers harmless generally. And with regard to businesses, while I don't think, I want to amend the answer I gave earlier to Mr. Upton, while I don't think it makes sense to do allowances generally for businesses, there may be particular businesses or particular sectors that need transition help of some sort, whether it's through allowances or other mechanisms. I'm not sure what the best mechanism is.
Dr. Michaels, what's your response to that?
It's not at all clear to me how, again, it simply reduces to a question of scarcity. All you are doing is making something scarce that was relatively abundant before, and there's no way, there are ways to make a little bit more or a little bit less be borne by one class of customers or another. But by and large, this is very, very small relative to the totality that's being contemplated here if I look at the bill.
My time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Mr. Morgan, currently, what percentage of the District of Columbia electricity is produced by what's defined as renewable electricity in this bill?
Well, the District of Columbia currently imports more than 98% of its electricity from outside. So it's a little bit hard to answer that question. We do have some solar generation on some federal facilities and universities and a growing number of homes.
But you don't have a percentage?
I don't. I can tell you it's very small.
Okay. I think as a customer, and some members are customers, I remember, on a yearly basis, we get ours in our bill showing what percentage, and it is very small. I think less than 1%.
Actually, we do have a requirement for the load-serving entities to report on the energy mix. Most of that power is imported and includes renewables.
Well, again, whether you import it or what, because we import power. In fact, that's the goal of this bill, is to be able to import power from parts of the country that generate it to parts that don't. So, but it's still the mandate would cover it. And I noticed the public counsel for Columbia's People Council, Betty Knoll, was concerned about the 20% mandate that the district's standard would cost about $26 million annually. Does the D.C. currently have a 20% mandate?
Yes, the City Council recently increased the renewables portfolio standard for the district to eventually reach 20% in the year 2020. That's correct.
Okay. Let me ask our other from groups, the co-ops, the EEI, and in the public sector. What are the percentage, Glenn, or does co-ops actually have? And I know you had a discussion on what is considered. I know the bill actually considers qualified hydropower, but what is a percentage of the rural co-ops that have, and what would be defined as renewable energy in the bill?
As I mentioned, it'd be 11, as defined by the bill, it'd be down to about 2%. Okay. Would be roughly what we have.
General hydropower is not quote qualified.
That's correct.
Okay. Same in the case of the publics, Mr. Congressman. As customers of the power marketing administrations, they use a lot of hydroelectric. But if you're not including hydroelectric from either the PMAs or the generation that's owned by our members, it's right around the industry average, which is about 3%.
And I think on the investor-owned side, that may be a little higher than the general average, because we are complying with mandates in a number of states, but it's certainly no higher than 4% overall.
Okay. And I guess the last one would be and that's EEI, I guess, the investor-owned. Okay, thank you. That's, I guess, our concern on the electric, a national standard of 25%, although 25 by 25, and to get there. And I know in the state of Texas we're doing so many things with wind power, and actually our Public Utility Commission committed $5 billion to transmit that power within to get to the Dallas-Fort Worth, the urban markets, Austin, San Antonio, and Houston, Galveston. And the legislature now is expanding solar compared to what they did with wind power. But there's some concern we still may not be able to do 25% in 2025, even with the growth that we're doing. Is there a response to that compared to other states?
Mr. Congressman, I just add that the 15% limit that we support for a federal RES is really a very aggressive standard. When you look at the fact that right now the total national renewable resource capacity, excluding hydro, is about 3% in 2008. We're talking about a five-fold increase in a little over 10 years with 15%. And even with the recent state renewable energy standards Mr. Sturba referred to in the recent years, the year-over-year increase has been about 5%. To get just to 15%, you're talking about nearly a 14% year-over-year increase. I mean, it's a very aggressive standard.
Okay.
I would echo that, Mr. Green, and add one other thing, that it's not just the percentage, but it's also what qualifies.
Okay.
And that can dramatically change whether or not you can get to that standard. There's also an electrical stability issue associated with intermittent generation you have to be careful.
Okay. Mr. Bassett, in the few seconds I have left, some have discussed the EPA's preliminary and economic analysis, and have you had a chance to review it?
Yes.
And it does not assume an RES or a low-carbon fuel standard. Do you have any thoughts on the EPA's analysis, the economic analysis?
Well, I said earlier I thought it was a great first step. but it doesn't go far enough because there are overlapping mandates in this particular draft that have to be taken into consideration. I would think the committee would be remiss if they would move forward without having a complete analysis of all of the variables that are included in the draft, and then further understand what the simultaneous implementation of all those provisions would have that impact on consumers. So while I applaud it as a good first step, I don't think it goes far enough in dealing with the other provisions in the draft.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my first question is for Mr. Sturba and Mr. English, Mr. Crisson. What is your position with regards to implementing a domestic cap-and-trade program before there's a substantial and verifiable commitment to emissions reductions by China, India, and similar emission-heavy developing nations?
EEI's position is that we believe that the U.S. should provide leadership and go forward with some form of climate change legislation, but it must be in the context of international negotiations to help bring along the other countries, because if we're the only ones that do it, we don't get there. But neither do, and this is my personal statement, do I believe we can just say we won't do anything until the others do it first.
Mm-hmm. We agree that other countries should be included, and certainly some of the magnitude of China needs to be a party to this. I think there is an issue of who goes first. And as I said, the problem that we face right now is that we're going first unless the Congress wants to stop that through the Clean Air Act. I think the Supreme Court started that ball rolling nearly 2 years ago. So I suppose we're leading, but I certainly think that the Congress needs to do everything they can to get other countries to join with us.
Yes, Mr. Congressman, we would support moving ahead with a workable and sustainable cap-and-trade system or some kind of mechanism to address climate change in order to show leadership in the international community. We would be very concerned, however, if there was not some kind of reciprocity shown in the very near future by countries like China and India.
All right. And the next question is for, I guess, all of the panelists. What are your concerns or position on leakage, the process by which companies will move business operations to foreign countries to avoid higher costs in the U.S.? I guess let's go down the line. Yeah. Go ahead.
In California, that's been a very, very major issue with the implementation of the state program. And even the most optimistic projections that are coming from people who have been analyzing the state program, I don't place much faith in them, but even the most optimistic ones are that California is going to lose a very substantial fraction of what industrial load is left. Essentially, what's going to be left in California is only the kind of businesses that can't move because of their closeness to the consumer. Electrically, you're going to be seeing the same issue, and that's being played out once again, not just in California, but in the negotiations over the Western Climate Initiative. If California outlaws coal-fired power imports, it just means the plants in other states are going to produce electricity for those residents.
I think my answer to that question is obvious. Anytime there is a possibility for loss of jobs, whether it's major corporations or small businesses that will certainly be affected by this draft, they're concerned. And so that's why I think that going forward, we need to make certain that we're considering all of the variables. And that's why I've underscored my initial concerns earlier.
Anyone else?
Leakage is certainly a problem in any cap-and-trade regime, and we need to be really careful about how we approach it. It's one of the reasons that we need a national program, frankly, because of the state-to-state competition problems that cause leakage across state borders. And with respect to international arrangements, I support transitional assistance to industries that are affected by international trade concerns. And I think I echo the comments of those made earlier that we as a nation need to be engaged quite actively with other countries to make sure that we create, over time, as level a playing field as we can.
I agree with Mr. Coward. I think we need to look at the issue of leakage in the context of an international approach, the fact that the United States is thus far not part of international agreements, already is creating a leakage problem in the other direction. What we really need to do is work together with other nations to address this problem. And I also wanted to highlight the issue of leakage when you're looking at state or regional programs, which are already in place in parts of the U.S. And as Mr. Cowart said, that is a problem that can be solved by developing a national program and having arrangements for dealing with interchange between U.S. and Canada of electricity and that sort of thing.
We have already seen in the past the comment about rush to gas. We have seen that impact businesses and industries in our areas when we had gas used so much for power generation. What this has the potential to do is, in addition to increasing the demand for natural gas, if we have carbon allowance costs for residential customers and small businesses, it has the potential to impact their businesses and do just what you fear. So for those reasons, we think it's necessary that we deal with the allowances and allocating those in the appropriate way to mitigate that impact.
Yes, Mr. Congressman, we share that concern, and as Mr. Somerhalder pointed out, this is one of the big advantages of 100% allocation of allowances, particularly in the transition in the early years as we move to a low-carbon energy system.
I agree. One of the biggest challenges that we can face is not just thinking about what's the impact on electricity, but what's the impact on the mix. If we throw coal out prematurely out of the mix, we can have a significant impact on natural gas prices that not only affect residential customers, but all of the industries that use it as feedstock, and the inability for them to remain competitive in an international market.
Thank you. The gentleman's time is
Thank you very much.
Thank you. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Two of the issues that have been raised constantly, among others, are the impact on jobs, but also the impact on cost, the cost to the consumer. Mr. Cowart, welcome. You and I worked together in Vermont and appreciate the work you did there and around the country and the world. I'd ask you to further elaborate on the potential of efficiency as a means of reducing energy costs. I mean, if we are going to be concerned about the consumer, as we must, residential consumer and the business consumer, to elaborate on how efficiency can be their friend.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the efficiency opportunity is well demonstrated throughout the country. The reservoir is large and it's largely untapped, and it can be tapped at low cost. We know that in the power sector we could achieve at least 1%, probably 2% a year in total demand reduction incrementally through aggressive energy efficiency programs that would be cost effective. They would save customers more money than they cost. And what happens when you do that is really 4 things. First of all, every customer who is participating in an efficiency program or is investing in efficiency will see a lower bill. That's the first benefit. The second benefit is that by reducing demand for electricity and natural gas, we reduce the clearing prices, and those benefits occur to everybody on the system. Mm-hmm. So the upward pressure that we're worried about here on clean energy and on energy prices generally can be significantly moderated by energy efficiency at the customer level. The third benefit is that by reducing demand for consumption, we actually reduce demand for carbon allowances. And this is part of the answer to Dr. Michael's concern about scarcity. I mean, one of the ways to affect any scarce resource is to reduce demand for it, which can be done through energy efficiency, reducing demand for carbon allowances. And then the last point, for the half of the United States that exists in a competitive wholesale power market arena, is that when you reduce clearing prices and when you reduce carbon prices, you're reducing the cost of power across almost all megawatt hours across the entire grid. So the benefits from being a lot smarter about efficiency can be quite widespread.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Greenstein, given your proposal and your concerns about LDCs, but the objective you have to protect consumers. What are your thoughts on allocating allowances, 15%, I think is a figure people have used, to LDC specifically for efficiency to reduce cost to consumers?
I don't have any specific percentage. I agree with Mr. Coward and others that efficiency is important. I'm not an expert on what is the best way under this bill to achieve the efficiency gains. To the degree that allocating permits to LDCs specifically for efficiency would be the best or one of the best ways to get efficiency gains, if that's the case, then I would think it's a good idea. I certainly think that there ought to be some efficiency investment under this legislation.
Okay, Mr. Sturba, what about you? Is efficiency got to be a core component of any approach to address this problem?
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the areas where state regulators come into play in helping develop, along with utilities, the elimination of disincentives and the provision of incentives such that we maximize energy efficiency capacity.
And what would you define as the specific disincentives to utilities to aggressively promote efficiency?
One that exists in many jurisdictions today is the fact that you're incented to sell more of a product. That's wrong. We need to change that fundamental business model.
Which we would do by what?
Well, it can be done by a number of mechanisms. People use the phrase decoupling as one. The problem is it means a lot of different things to different people, but there are clearly mechanisms that we can change that business model.
Okay, thank you. My time has expired. Who's next? Do we have anybody else? Okay. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the members of the panel. Let me try to go through a series of questions. Mr. Sturba, let me begin with you. Certain energy sources are subsidized by the federal government. What I'd like to do is see if you can tell me, if you can quantify for me how much, whether it's by kilowatt or by megawatt, the subsidy for natural gas is. Do you know that number?
I do not.
Would you assume it's zero or near zero? Does anybody in the panel know? How about the subsidy for coal per megawatt or kilowatt? Mr. English?
I think when you get in and you talk about the issue of subsidy, that gets to be very misleading. Now, if you're talking about using the tax code and providing benefits on the tax code as being part of that subsidy, then I think every fuel has a subsidy. Every fuel receives assistance.
Do you know how much? What I'm trying to do is get
amounts. I don't have amounts.
I'm trying to get the relative amount of the subsidy. We know there's a substantial subsidy for solar. Is that correct? Does somebody know how much it is per megawatt?
Currently, the production tax credit is, I believe, 2.1 cents for renewables, and then it could also be investment tax credit, which is 30%, I believe.
So can you give me a number per megawatt for solar? Or
well, the production tax credit would be 2.1 cents or $21 a megawatt hour.
Okay, and then the other one you mentioned?
Well, that would be applicable to any renewable at this time. I would agree with Mr. English. There are certain built subsidies that have occurred at different stages of fuel being developed. Any fuel source that was developed probably had some subsidies at different points in time.
Do you know what the current subsidy for wind is?
It would be, on the production tax credit, it would be the same, the 2.1 cents per kilowatt hour.
I thought it would be useful to know what those subsidies are relative one fuel to the other, natural gas or coal, relative to solar and wind. The next question I'd like to ask is to the entire panel, and I'd like to get a yes or no answer from each of you, if I might. Do you agree that this legislation, will increase the cost of energy produced in the United States, yes or no? Mr. Sturba?
Yes, the degree to which it does is dependent on
yes, yes or no? I'm short on time.
Yes.
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 Qualified yes.
Qualified yes.
Yes.
Unqualified yes.
Yes. If you agree that it will in fact increase the cost of energy in the United States, do you also agree that it will increase the cost of all goods which require energy to produce them? Steel or anything?
Yes.
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 To the extent efficiency substitutes for energy, no.
Yes.
Yes.
In general, yes.
Dr. Michaels, did I get my unqualified yes?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Let me just ask you another. Isn't it in fact, and I think either Mr. Cowart or Mr. Greenstein, you made this point, one of the goals of the legislation is to increase the cost of energy to induce the efficiency that you talk about, Mr. Cowart, and to discourage the use or the consumption of energy. Isn't that correct, Mr. Sturba?
I think the purpose is to provide a price signal for a commodity that is, by public policy opinion, being made scarce.
Which you do by increasing cost, right?
Well, yes.
Thank you. Mr. English?
I'm not going to interpret motives here, but let me just say I think we have to say on the front end of it that it's basically to reduce the emission of carbons.
By sending a price signal?
It does set a price by putting a limitation on the carbon being used in the country. Yes, that sends a price signal.
Combination of cap and price.
I agree.
I actually don't think that the purpose is to raise the price. The purpose is to reduce emission.
Did Mr. Morgan not respond?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
He jumped ahead of me. Well, I do agree that the purpose is to send a price signal. Putting a cap on the quantity is one way of doing that, but price
well, you're putting
alone,
a cap. You're not putting a cap on the total quantity. You're putting the cap on the quantity per industry, and then charging for that for anyone. Actually, you might charge for that initial cap, and then also charge for exceeding the cap.
Well, either way, I mean, you are trying to make the product more scarce, as Dr. Michaels pointed out,
by increasing the price and sending a price signal.
That's correct. That is certainly part of the purpose. Of course, as we pointed out, there are some ways to offset that.
Sure. Yeah. We're not talking about offsetting it, but does it in fact send a price signal, or isn't that a part of the structure of the bill, Mr. Cowart?
I think that a price signal is useful, but that the other policies that are inherent in the bill are actually more important.
Thank you, Mr. Green. I really was looking for, does it,
it's
one of the goals to send a price signal, increasing the price of the cost of energy so that we consume less and therefore reduce CO2 emissions.
A key purpose is to send a price signal both so that we consume less, but also that we switch to cleaner sources of energy. But the fact that it sends a price signal should not be interpreted to be a negative for the economy.
I was just asking the question. Don't read motives in my question, just Dr. Michaels?
It's a price signal. The real question with price is always, what are you getting for it? If in fact we're getting very little in the way of solutions to the whole world's carbon problem, then all we are doing is it's a burnt offering type of sacrifice.
Mr. Bassett?
I won't ascribe motives to the drafters or to your question, but I will say that the net effect of setting a price signal in this instance will raise prices.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, my time is...
And I was wondering whether Mr. Michaels was an Old Testament or New Testament, which
I'm ready to go in that debate, Mr. Chairman, anytime.
The gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier, I think some people involved in the discussion have implied that this is the only piece of legislation that's out there that addresses an energy policy. I would direct them to an alternative plan that's been on the table for about a year now and is actually still out there on debate, something that we're going to be presenting. Most of the components of this bill, the American Energy Act that was filed in the last Congress, will be filed again and debated as part of an alternative to this cap-and-trade energy tax, but it's a bill that actually involves an all-of-the-above energy policy that will not only support and, in fact, fund research and development to advance the alternatives like wind and solar, but also make a recognition of our own natural resources here in this country to explore additional natural resources like oil, like natural gas, the sources that we're using today, clean coal technology, and also nuclear power, which is a very reliable, efficient source of energy many other countries are using, that this cap-and-trade energy tax does not contemplate at all, and then also encourage people to make those efficiencies that they're making today that many more will make. So anybody who suggests that one group of people on this committee is just against everything. They're being very disingenuous because this is a bill that's been out there for about a year now, many of the components of which will be presented as an alternative, a bill that will actually create American jobs here in this country, create those green jobs that we're talking about, but not invoke policies that will export millions of jobs out of this country, which the cap-and-trade energy bill clearly will do. No one has disputed those findings. And so with that, I go to the bill that we're debating today, and specifically the allocation policies that this panel is discussing. And I'm going to have some questions, but first, for those of us that have been going through this bill, one of the big frustrations that we feel is not only a frustration to us as members, I'm sure many of you who are trying to do analysis of this bill, but also to the American people who are trying to contemplate whether or not this is good policy or bad, is the main details of this bill, especially what this committee is talking about today on allocation policies. If you go to page 478 of the bill, which actually is supposed to be talking about the main source of how this whole cap-and-trade scheme would work, let's go through disbursement of allowances and proceeds from auctions of allowances. Subsection A, allocation of emission allowances. The administrator shall allocate emission allowances established under Section 721 in the following amounts. So you want to go read those amounts. It says, to be supplied. Section's blank. You go next to Section B, auction of emission allowances. The administrator shall auction emission allowances established under Section 721 in the following amounts. To be supplied. Subsection 3, funds established. There is established in the Treasury of the United States the following funds. The Strategic Reserve Fund, 1. Number 2, other funds to be supplied. We're talking about what many people have described as one of the most important initiatives brought before this Congress in decades, the most important change in energy policy our country has probably seen, and the bulk of the details don't even exist today, aren't even presented to the public. Now, there's discussion that many of these details are being worked out behind closed doors, and some of those deals are being cut as we speak. Unfortunately, none of that's being done here in this committee meeting, where the transparency is supposed to be, where people can actually watch and participate in a discussion, where experts can actually give detailed analysis of the components of the bill and the policies that would affect every consumer in America. And so with that, I want to ask Mr. Bassett, because you've testified that you talked about the rigorous cost analysis that you would like to see done on it. When it comes to the details of this bill that are completely left unanswered, how do you do a real cost analysis to estimate how much this is going to cost American families, how many jobs will be exported to foreign countries, when so many of the details are left out?
Well, you can't, and that's a concern that I have as I was reviewing the bill, and I know that consumers across the country are going to have. And so what I would do is encourage this committee, before you move, is to consider cost estimates on every provision that's in the bill, and then go further, as I've said earlier, then test for the impact that a simultaneous implementation of those are going to be. I just don't see how you can reach a conclusion as grave as this. I mean,
and I know we're running out of time. I'm sorry to cut you off. I would ask anybody on the panel if they would address the question, should we, and is it responsible to go forward with a debate on a bill this important when so many of the key components are not even included that we can assess, analyze, and discuss? Does anybody think it's responsible to be going forward with this right now? Nobody responded. I yield back my time.
Could I just say there's every reason to have debate on all the issues we already know, all the parts of the bill that are filled in, and what a number of us think or are recommending today should be in there for the parts of the bill that aren't filled in. And I presume at the appropriate time you'll get a fully filled in bill, and you'll all have further debate on it at that time. So this
right, and with 9 panelists, we probably have 9 different ideas that are very divergent on how that should be. Unfortunately, we should be all debating one set, because ultimately this committee would pass one set plan, not 9 different plans. Unfortunately, we can't debate that one set plan because it doesn't exist and it's not before us today.
I think the gentleman's time has expired. Unless the gentleman from New York has questions, then all time for questioning for this panel has been completed. But you have provided a very valuable set of testimonies for the committee, and I can actually see some
I won't call them deals, but I can actually see some new working arrangements that could be constructed out of your testimony to create a format, to create a formula that we might be able to use. And amongst your testimony, I think that it has been perhaps the most productive that we've had so far, because these are very thorny questions, but yet I can see a lot of desire to find a working formula that we could use, and we thank you for your test. The gentleman from Oregon.
Yeah, I'm not going to trigger the House 5-minute rule, but I would just, following on what you said, because somebody here on the panel mentioned the importance of worker transition during this process. I don't remember who it was, but somebody did. And I would refer them to page 568, where the section 424 for worker transition is. I'd encourage you to read it fully, because all we can read is to be supplied.
I thank the gentleman very much, and we thank all of you for your testimony, and we would like to stay in close working cooperation with you in the next month or so. Thank you.
Right, so just need a second.
Now we would ask our second group of witnesses to please come up and to take their places at the witness table.